Good evening, everyone. It is 6 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to our number 2 class in our series this year on preventing diabetes. This is February, so we're doing one class a month this year of 2025. And last month we covered kind of the intro to pre-diabetes and why does it matter, and thinking about getting ready for, making some changes, making some lifestyle, and maybe some dietary changes. We're going to delve into the dietary side of things in more detail tonight. So if some of you were here last month, I'm going to have a hard time with, we used to do this weekly. So I'm going to have a hard time with that. Instead of saying week, I'm going to have to say month. So if you were here last month, I would love for you to go ahead and put in the chat, not the chat, sorry, the Q&A, because we have disabled the chat, just the Q&A, maybe one change that you've been making, or one thing that you actually tackled from class last month, which was to look at your wellness vision and take some time to think about where you're headed with your health, and maybe a goal that you're working on. So if you want to take some time to do that, that'd be great. And for those of you who are new, my name is Megan. I'm a registered dietitian nutritionist. I'm also a certified diabetes care and education specialist. So those are my credentials there. And I am remiss in that I didn't get Stilly Valley's logo on this page. I will do that before I send out the slides to you guys. But Stilly Valley Health Connections is sponsoring this series this year. So that's who you signed up through and who you're getting those reminders from. And they host a number of classes to help with health, including some in-person cooking demos. So if you're in the area, the Arlington, Smoky Point area, it'd be lovely to see some of you in person. All right, let's get to our slides. I know I had a hard time with this last time with how my advancing is working. Okay, let me see what you guys are saying in the Q&A. So Barbara's saying non-starchy recommends 1/2 cup cooked. Does this include roasted? Ah, yes. So anytime that you are cooking vegetables or proteins, anything that you're cooking is going to lose a little bit of volume. And so if you think about like meat or proteins, for example, we tend to have an average of about 25% volume loss. So if you have like a 1/4 pounder burger, it's going to really end up being about like 3 ounces when you're done. And that's true of like vegetables too. So when they say like the recommendation is for cooked, that is like steamed, roasted, sauteed, because it's losing some of that moisture and it's like getting a little bit more concentrated. So yeah, that 1/2 cup cooked for the, it's really for the starchy vegetables, would be about a carb portion or about 15 grams of carbohydrate. Great, great question. And Vicki says, I increased my vegetable and fruit intake, so it's included in at least 2 meals, plus your afternoon snack. Fantastic. I love it. It's great. Okay, let me try and share my slides again. Hopefully you guys can see these. Our screen sharing. These are not sharing. I'm not seeing my slides, so just gonna get out of this view. Start over. There we go. Okay. So we're checking in on the homework. If you haven't done the homework from the first class, you have the recording and you have the slides and you also have possibly the book. So you can go back through and do that wellness vision. Take a little bit of time of thinking about where you're headed with this and what kind of changes you want to be making. We'll talk a little bit more about SMART goals later today. But let's delve into the diet side of things. So this is chapter 3. There's a lot of information in this chapter. And you might be having questions like, how many meals should I have a day? How often should I be eating? Should I be snacking or not? What about protein? What about meat? We don't have a holy grail for everybody. Like we don't even have like a holy grail or like the exact diet or ratios of carbs, protein, and fat for everybody. Some people do better with high protein. Some people do better with high carbohydrate, like a vegetarian diet with high fiber. And we'll talk about some of those variations in a little bit. But we do have some general characteristics of healthy dietary patterns that we will definitely talk about. And hopefully it will give you some ideas of like what's missing from your diet. And when I say diet, I really mean like dietary intake. So I'm not talking about something restrictive. I'm really talking about just what is your eating like what are you having in your everyday intake? Oftentimes people, think of the word diet and they think of restriction. So we want to kind of get out of that restrictive mindset. Now, some people may have some specific things that they need to avoid, like, let's say they have celiac disease and they really truly do need to be gluten-free. So there are some very specific, restricted patterns that are based on medical necessity versus, just thinking about restriction in general with the word diet. So, yeah, all that to say, when you hear that word from me, I'm just meaning your intake. And we're really, wanting to get out of restriction and thinking about more health and balanced take. But in general, a winning combination of things is going to be nutrient-dense foods. So foods that have a lot of nutrition, like vitamins and minerals compared to calories. It's a pattern of intake and foods that you actually enjoy eating because it's got to be sustainable for you. You feel good on it. You feel satisfied. You feel energized. It's not giving you like tummy trouble. And yeah, it's something that you can do long term. So over the next months here, as we do these check-ins and we do these classes, hopefully you're going to be making little changes, little tiny steps in the direction that you want to be heading that will be sustainable if you're making them small enough and you're making them, out of things that you do enjoy. Maybe it's just some little tweaks to your dietary intake versus like a full revamp. And we'll talk about, setting those goals in a little bit. But expect your diet to change over time. So, we have different needs at different life stages, whether you are like pregnancy is a big one, that makes a huge change. And sometimes in pregnancy, we do have a increased risk of blood sugars being elevated with gestational diabetes and the hormones that happen in pregnancy. So, your needs might be different from, what they were just 6 months ago. Or as we're aging, we tend to need a little bit less total calories as we age, but then we have some protein needs as we age in order to kind of keep that muscle mass on us. If you have a wound or you're healing from a surgery or something like that, your dietary intake recommendations would change based on what's going on with your health at that moment. So, it shouldn't be a static thing that's just always the same, because it should be fluxing to meet what your needs are at that time. Like, what if you increase your exercise and all of a sudden you may need to be changing your dietary intake a little bit? Okay. Focus on what to add. So this is a tip when you are making changes. Ideally, you would be focusing on the positive or focusing on what you can add, what you're missing versus what to remove, because our diet culture is so all about restriction. We want to be out of that mindset and really be focusing on the nutrition. What can you add? So here are some things to be asking yourself. How will you make the changes? Or maybe you have some ideas already about like what you want to change. What unhealthy foods could I eat less of? What foods could I eat more of? How can you maybe make some swaps for some of those like low nutrient density foods for high nutrient density foods? Like snacking is a classic place where we can make some of those swaps. Maybe portions need to be adjusted a little bit. Maybe just cooking at home a little bit more so you're more in control of what's going into the meals and portions. But approach this with some curiosity, keep an open mind. Um, and I would kind of be a little scientist about it, like what's working for you and think about what you're missing. Do some experiments. If you have foods that you haven't tried, maybe you're actually experimenting with putting some new things into your diet and getting used to that just from even a palate sense. Okay. So healthy eating patterns, basically, we're looking at the sum of all the foods and the nutrients that you're taking in. So that would include like supplements or like shakes, things like that. And the dietary guidelines indicate that a pattern higher in vegetables, fruits, whole grains, and lower in red and processed meats, high fat dairy, refined grains, sweets, sugar sweetened beverages, a pattern like that can reduce the risk of developing type 2. So more of your vegetables, fruits, and whole grains and less of those other things can be helpful for preventing diabetes. And so for most people, this means more plants. For most people, we're not eating enough of the fruits, vegetables, whole grains, nuts, and seeds. So more plants, please. But it doesn't mean that, a healthful diet or a well-balanced diet contains only those foods. And we actually see this in, if you've ever seen like the Blue Zones documentary on Netflix or read the Blue Zones books, some of the most healthiest people on the planet are eating mostly plants, but they also have small amounts of animal proteins in their diets, like dairy or fish or poultry or even beef and goat in some places. So, it's not overly restrictive, but we might be adjusting the portions a little bit. Because here's the typical American intake. Usually we have way too much calories and some of the things we don't want, like saturated fats, added sugars, fatty type of meat. So that would be the saturated fat that is found in animal proteins, baked goods, and highly processed grains. And it tends to be low in fish, fruits, vegetables, whole grains, beans, and legumes. And we do know that our typical American diet, or sometimes we call it the standard American diet or the SAD diet, is linked to increased risk of type 2 diabetes, heart disease, metabolic syndrome, cancer, and obesity. I don't think any of this is a surprise to you. So, yeah. But you can see here, like, just take a visual picture of this and look at how devoid of color. There's some artificial colors in there, but it's mostly like bland. It's very brown looking, right? We want it to be a lot more colorful than that. So here's one pattern that has been linked with reduced risk for developing diabetes. So the Mediterranean style eating pattern. And the Mediterranean is actually, a very broad region. But in general, we can see some patterns. So you can see this little pyramid here where, the majority of intake is based on whole grains, including starchy vegetables like potatoes and bread and pasta and rice. Lots and lots of fruits and vegetables, so very colorful. Heart healthy oil. And in this particular region, especially olive oil is featured. Some dairy in the form of cheese and yogurt mostly. A little bit of animal proteins, fish and seafood, poultry, eggs. And then at the very tippy top, red meat, and some sweets. So those are more occasional foods, not daily foods. And then we do know in the Mediterranean, also small amounts of alcohol are part of a typical dietary intake. And then the majority of fluids is water. So, not the sodas and the sugar sweetened beverages. But look at this picture with the fish and all those vegetables. Like, look at how colorful that is. I just love it. All right, let me check the Q&A really quick. Okay, great. Let's move on to the next dietary pattern. So the DASH diet, which stands for Dietary Approaches to Stop Hypertension. This was originally designed by the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, and it was designed to lower blood pressure, designed to help with hypertension. But what we found is that it actually was also very helpful for weight management and lowering risk of diabetes. And so this is another pattern that you could look into. It's basically rich in fruits, vegetables, low fat and non-fat dairy, whole grains, poultry, legumes. So that'd be like beans and lentils, and nuts. I would include seeds in that. And overall is low in sodium, added sugars, and saturated fats. The DASH is a little bit lower in fat and higher in dairy products compared to the Mediterranean pattern. So just slightly different there. So good for both heart health and for diabetes. And here is looking at a pyramid for the DASH diet. So you can see like they've swapped the grains and the fruits and vegetables a little bit. So their base is more those colorful plant foods, and then the whole grains, and then low fat dairy and seafood and lean meat are kind of in the middle of the pyramid for your protein sources. And then nuts and seeds and beans multiple times per week, and healthy fats for your dressings, sweets at the tippy top. Other patterns of intake that have been shown to be helpful and can be associated with better blood sugar control. So vegan patterns and vegetarian patterns, and of course we have different types of vegetarian patterns. So with vegan, that's someone who really doesn't eat any animal products, so they would need some supplementation in their life, specifically supplemental B12. And then with vegetarian, we have people who sometimes eat eggs, which would be ovo, or eat dairy, which would be lacto, or both, lacto-ovo, or pescatarians. So people who are mostly eating plants, but then also do fish and seafood. We have flexitarian patterns where it's mostly plants, but the occasional animal proteins thrown in there. And what really matters more than like, a name, or what you're calling it, is the quality of the foods. So for example, if you're trying to be a vegetarian and eating only mac and cheese, well, we know that's not going to be a well-rounded, balanced diet. It might be, lacto vegetarian, but not necessarily healthier. So we really want to focus on whole foods, higher fiber foods. And if you're doing whole foods, naturally, you will be getting higher fiber. Naturally, you'll also be getting more phytochemical, or another word for that is phytonutrient intake, basically plant-based nutrients, like all those colors that are in our foods, like polyphenols, for example. And if you're doing a lot of plants, it's going to be lower saturated fat just naturally, and naturally lower sodium, and higher in other minerals that help with blood pressure. So that would be things like potassium and magnesium. Okay, what about going low carbs? You probably have questions about this. In the research, the term low carb is very, very wide as far as what that means. So if you hear, a little snippet in the news or from social media about a study done on low carb, well, you really need to actually go to that study to even know what they were talking about. Were they talking about 40% from carbs, which would actually be lower than the acceptable macronutrient distribution range? Are they talking about 20% of calories coming from carbs? Are they talking about like almost like a keto diet, like very super low carbs. So you don't really know unless you go and look at what, what the range meant in that particular research paper. And so what I will say about that is we do have some evidence that lower carbohydrate can be helpful for some people, but we also have evidence that, like with a vegetarian pattern that is really high in carbs, but also high in fiber, that has also been associated with a link to reduction in type 2 diabetes. And even people with diabetes can have a higher carbohydrate intake as long as it is, from whole foods, higher fiber, and also we're thinking about pairing those carbs with other macronutrients like proteins and fats to help balance out blood sugar. And we're going to talk more about that pairing thing in a future class, but just know there's a lot of variation as far as like we don't have one set rule for how much carbohydrate. And that's also going to depend on the individual, like how active are you? If you are trying to run a marathon, you're going to need a lot more carbohydrates than someone who is sedentary, because that is our primary source of, that quick energy. Okay. Here are some diets ranked by the people who are in, like the professionals in this area. So the US News and World Report puts this out every year, and they basically poll professionals in the nutrition and weight management worlds to ask, like, what's the most evidence-based and what do people actually, what are people actually able to follow? Like what can be sustainable for people? And many years running now, it's been Mediterranean, DASH, and flexitarian as the top three. Okay, let me just check on the Q&A really quick. So, Stuart, you worked on your wellness vision. That's fantastic. Trying to set some reasonable goals for this week. I love that you said reasonable there. That is the key to it. Really good job. And then Nancy is saying, would unsweetened almond milk count as a serving of nuts? And the answer is no, because the almond milk has almost no protein in it. When you go look at that label, look at the nutrition facts panel on your almond milk. It's like 1 gram of protein per cup of almond milk. The protein is removed. That's not what's in almond milk. So yeah, if you're looking for protein, you really want to eat the actual nuts and the actual seeds. All right, here's one way to kind of approach meals. If you're looking for a visual, this is a really nice, easy way to break up your plate. So first of all, we want to think about like how big is the plate, right? Like, is it a platter? And we'll have a class on eating out later on in the year. So is it like a platter, or, is it a 9-inch plate, or is it a 12-inch? Sometimes the plates, they've gotten bigger over the years. So check your plate. And then an easy way to balance out to get a variety of intake and be balancing your carbs and protein and your non-starchy vegetables is just to cut that plate in half, and half of the plate would be your non-starchy vegetables. So that means they're going to be lower in carb, higher in fiber, very filling. Ideally, you'd have a couple different colors in there. Could even be like a salad, like a really big salad to go with your carbs and your protein. So this would include things like broccoli, cabbage, tomatoes, green beans, peppers, zucchinis. I will also say a couple tricky ones in this category: beets and carrots. They get a bad rap for being high in sugar, but they're actually like the beets that we eat. They're not the sugar beets that are made into sugar. And carrots get a bad rap because of the glycemic index research, where you're eating like 3 pounds of carrots to spike your blood sugar. Don't worry about that. Carrots are non-starchy vegetables. So enjoy your carrots. They go on that half of your plate. And then you can divide the other half into quarters. So, or half again. So a quarter would be your carbohydrate and a quarter would be your protein. So for example, with the protein, like, fish, lean beef, tofu, eggs, with the starches, things like corn. So there are some starchy vegetables that we include in this 1/4 of the plate, and that would be like corn, potatoes are starchy, winter squash, like butternut squash, acorn squash, peas out of the pod, so like your green peas that have been shelled, and then beans and lentils, actually. Even though beans and lentils have quite a bit of protein, we put them in this carbohydrate section when you're thinking about blood sugar control because they do have quite a bit of starch in them. So I kind of view beans as like the perfect food. Like they're technically vegetables, they have the protein, they have the carbs. So really they're like in the middle of this plate, but from an adding up for a carbohydrate sense, you know, you can put them in that carbohydrate portion and then you won't be overdoing it on the carbs. So this is one way to kind of think about it. So think about your plate right now. What does it look like compared to this? Probably you're missing the vegetables. Like the vegetables need to be bumped up and the protein and the carbs can be a little bit less. And when you bump up the vegetables, it really does help with that satisfaction piece because you're going to feel more full with all of that volume and that fiber. Barbara's asking how to balance a plate for breakfast. Yeah, so you can do the same kind of thing for breakfast. So like let's say you do an egg scramble. Your eggs would be your protein. Maybe you have an English muffin on the side and you scramble a bunch of vegetables in with the eggs. Or you could do something totally different. Like maybe you take Greek style yogurt as your protein source, and your carbohydrate food are berries on the top of that. And maybe you don't have the non-starchy vegetables. If you want to have vegetables with breakfast, be my guest. Some people love like salad at breakfast. But if that just feels a little weird to you, then you could move those veggies somewhere else in your day, like a snack. So that could be an option. Okay. Here's another way to look at a plate, but I will say that this one from the Harvard Medical School was not specific to blood sugar control. It's just kind of a general healthy plate. And what they did here is they included the fruits in this half of the plate. And when you look at if any of you have kids or grandkids, when you look at like the My Plate from the USDA information, the plate looks like this, where there's vegetables and fruits on one half, and then your protein and like grains or starches on the other half. The thing I will say about this is that sometimes if you've got the fruit and the grains together in one meal, it might be a little bit too much carbohydrate, just depending on where you're at with your blood sugar control. And if you have a glucometer, you could check that. You could check a blood sugar before a meal and check your blood sugar 2 hours after the meal and see what the change is in that blood sugar rise. A normal change is about 30 to 60 points for a meal. So if you're changing from like 100 to 200, then I would think about, do you have too much carbohydrate there? Or maybe not enough non-starchy vegetable or protein to slow it down. Like maybe you had just straight carbs. And think about the balance a little bit because you can tweak these things to whatever your blood sugar is like right now. And some people need a little bit more, some people need a little bit less. Okay. We do want to be thinking about, let me check the Q&A before I move on. Oatmeal. Oatmeal is a carb. It's a grain. Yeah. So if you're doing oatmeal for breakfast, think about what protein you could add to that. Barbara was asking the question about oatmeal. So maybe like peanut butter in your oatmeal and some walnuts on top, or a little Greek yogurt and a sprinkle of almonds, or maybe you have a hard-boiled egg on the side, or maybe you make it savory oatmeal where it's like you can put the hard-boiled egg in it, so it's like savory made with chicken broth, and then you can actually add vegetables to that. I love savory oatmeal, it's so good. And then Joelle commented spinach in a smoothie. Yeah, that's a great way to add vegetables to your breakfast. Just blend it in. Love it. Okay, nutrient density. So we're really looking for, what is packed into that food. And if it is a real whole food, there's going to be a lot of nutrients in there. Besides the vitamins, minerals, and fiber, which we kind of all know about, The other big piece of this are those phytochemicals or phytonutrients, which a lot of them have anti-inflammatory and antioxidant properties. And so we do know that they're helpful for us as well as being helpful for our microbiome. So basically, the microbes that live in our gut specifically, we've got different microbiomes like skin and but specifically in your gut, where you're feeding your gut food, some of your microbes really like the colors. Some like different colors, some like different fibers. So it's really nice to have a variety of different plant intakes so that you're really helping those beneficial bacteria to reproduce and thrive. And then they do things for your health and they're kind of working for you. They're like your little minions in your gut, but you got to feed them well. Okay. Let's move on to whole grains. So I know when people get a diagnosis of prediabetes, oftentimes they start removing things instead of like making swaps. They just like start doing that restriction thing. So I would think about some swaps with your grains. So instead of like white rice, not that you can't include white rice, you certainly can, but you might need to watch the portion a little bit more. But you could do something that's more whole grain. So instead of just the starchy part or the endosperm of that refined grain, when you have a whole grain, you have the bran, so you've got all that fiber, you've got the B vitamins, and you also have the germ, which has even more vitamins and the healthy fats in there. And you're typically also going to feel a lot more full, like satiated with the whole grains versus the refined grains because of that fat. There's also a little bit more protein and the fiber there. So here's just a list of some whole grain ideas. Like popcorn is a popular one. That would be great. 3 cups of popcorn is only 1 carbohydrate portion, or about 15 grams of carbohydrate. So that could be a nice snack. I would still pair that with a little protein, like a handful of nuts, for example, or a string cheese, which is a low fat, naturally low fat cheese. Or some other grains like quinoa, or the oats were mentioned earlier, barley is a nice grain, brown and wild rice or red rice. If you've never had red rice, it's so good. So don't cut out grains completely if you don't have to for some reason, because they are actually associated with lower diabetes risk. So yeah, we don't want to just like cut things out completely, but maybe make some swaps. So for example, like in oats, we have really good soluble fiber, that beta glucan fiber, which we know is associated with gut microbiome health and with our heart health. Also, the fiber can help lower blood glucose levels and lower cholesterol. Barley also contains beta glucans. Our legumes and pulses, which is, we already talked about, is a vegetable, is a protein source, and is a carb, have some really beneficial starches in them, or basically like longer chains of glucose that can feed your gut microbiome. That's sometimes why we get a little bit gassy with them, because the microbiome loves eating on them. And that starch, then those bacteria basically make short chain fatty acids that have been shown to be really helpful for us. Okay. Nuts help improve glucose levels. They're mostly heart healthy fat, protein, and fiber. So nuts would be a great addition to your dietary intake if you don't have any nuts in your diet right now. And I would add seeds to this list. And get a variety if you can, because they have different minerals in there, different vitamins and minerals. And even like a little bit different fat profiles. So for example, walnuts are really high in the plant-based omega-3, so the ALA omega-3. Also, you can find that omega-3 in chia seeds, ground flax seeds, and hemp hearts. Peanuts are fantastic for nutrition. They have a really high profile of the monounsaturated fat, which is very similar to your olive oil, and of course have some protein and fiber in there as well. So if you like nuts and seeds, get a variety. And do know that Yes, they are calorie dense because they're a little bit higher in fat, but do know that the calories that are on the package, that is from burning those nuts and seeds in a bomb calorimeter where they like burn everything. So like all the fiber that we don't digest and absorb, every single calorie of that is counted. Whereas when you eat nuts and seeds, we don't absorb all those calories that were actually measured. And so on average, we're consuming about 20 to 25, like we're absorbing about 20 to 25% less calories than what it says on the label. But that being said, like sometimes if you've got the big box store bag of the mixed nuts and you're just going to town, do be careful with that because I have seen that sabotage some weight goals in the past. So, portion out your nuts. It's like a handful of nuts, not just like continual grazing on nuts. But we do see that there's an association actually with nut intake and weight management because they are so satisfying. So even though you're adding those calories in, usually what happens is later in the day, calorie intake goes down. So like when you put nuts at a snack, for example, in the afternoon. So it can be really helpful addition to your diet if you're not having them. One caveat, be careful of the salt. So if you can get the unsalted, that would be great. Or sometimes what I'll do is I'll buy a bunch of different unsalted, if I'm making like my own mixed nuts, I'll buy unsalted, almonds and walnuts and cashews or whatever we want to put in there, and then do one salted thing, like salted sunflower seeds that then goes in the mix and kind of permeates throughout. So it's not just everything is salted, but you have a little bit of flavor in there. So that's a trick that we do at home. And the nuts contain unsaturated fats, so that reduces heart disease risk. They're anti-inflammatory, so it can help with insulin sensitivity. And that would include things like your olive, canola, peanut oil, tree nuts, peanuts, nut butters. So like almond butter or peanut butter, avocados, the almonds themselves, fantastic. And then as far as the dairy side of things go, we do have some research on yogurt specifically reducing the risk of type 2 diabetes. And we're not really sure what's going on with that. We know from prior research that there is an association with dairy intake and lower obesity risk. So it might be a little bit weight management. It might be a little bit of gut microbiome because there's some probiotics in the yogurt. And then also with the low-fat dairy, there is an association with better blood pressure as well because of the minerals in there, the magnesium and calcium specifically. And so we think, it's maybe just like a synergistic effect, like all of those things coming together that provide us with a little bit of, that association with healthier outcomes. Okay. Your book talks specifically about berries, and I will say not just for type 2 diabetes risk lowering, but also for your long-term dementia risk lowering. Ideally, you would be including some dark colored berries like your blueberries, blackberries, raspberries, strawberries, marionberries, that like dark purple, blue, red color scheme. Try and include those daily if you can. And a great way to do that is just like keep it in the freezer section, buy the big, I'm going to say Costco because Costco is local here. Buy the big triple berry Costco bag because it's a good deal. You can keep it in the freezer and just grab a handful of those berries to throw in your yogurt or throw in your oatmeal, throw in your smoothie. You can put them lots of different places and they're, tasty and convenient. Herbs and spices are a great addition too, because you're getting a lot of bang for your buck there. So a lot of phytonutrients without the calories. So talk about like nutrient density. Herbs and spices are one of the best deals. And we do know that some of those anti-inflammatory components in your herbs and spices can be really helpful, not just for blood sugar, but just like general health and heart health. You've probably heard about cinnamon being potentially beneficial on blood glucose. You know, it's mixed. The research on that is mixed, and the amount of effect is not huge, but there's no real downside to adding cinnamon to your toast or cinnamon to your yogurt or cinnamon on top of your coffee, for example. So if you want to do that, you know, the more the merrier. Just go for it. And what I love about the herbs and spices in your cooking is that it is self-limiting. Like you're going to do it to taste versus, you know, taking a bunch of supplements, which sometimes people are getting too much concentration in the supplement forms and can cause some damage either to the liver, especially if it's like, you know, not a supplement that has been regulated or third party tested, or GI. So I see a lot of GI issues with like really high doses of these things, like high dose cinnamon. So be careful, you know, if you're taking it in a capsule or a tablet or a form that's not natural, because you can get a big dose of these things, which might not actually be to your benefit. But if you're using it in your cooking and your flavoring, you know, you're not going to overdo it that way. Vinegar. So vinegar is interesting. Anytime you change the pH of a meal, so you add a little bit of acid to the meal, we do see that the gastric emptying or your stomach emptying into your small intestine is a little slower. So the area under the curve of what your blood sugar looks like, or like basically how your blood sugar is spiking after the meal, tends to be a little bit less, a little bit lower. And so, you know, a little bit of like vinegar on your salad, for example, is a great idea, or a little bit of like balsamic vinegar on your roasted vegetables would be lovely. So if you want to add a little bit of vinegar to your meals, um, you know, we do have some research. It's not super robust, but a little bit of research that it could be helpful. Um, don't be just like adding a bunch of like drinking a bunch of vinegar though. Like don't go down that rabbit hole from you know, social media and on the internet about like just drinking apple cider vinegar. You really can do damage to your tooth enamel and your throat if you're just like straight up consuming it. So be careful with, you know, some of those things online that might sound a little crazy because they might be. All right. What about coffee? So we are here in the Seattle area, Seattle metro area. We love our coffee here in the Northwest, partly because the winters are so dark. But we do see a reduction in risk actually with type 2 diabetes and coffee intake, which is probably related to the antioxidants in the coffee. I will make mention though, if you're trying to keep your cholesterol under good control and you are an espresso person, I would consider transitioning to a filtered coffee, like that goes through a paper filter, like drip, for example, or pour over coffee, because there's a couple terpenes that are in your coffee beans that actually can raise your LDL a little bit, the bad cholesterol. And so we're not sure if that really like means anything as far as like long-term outcomes, as far as like risk of heart attack and stroke and things like that. But if you're really working hard at lowering your LDL and you're just like, oh, you just can't get it down and you're an espresso person, you know, consider going with a paper filtered coffee instead and see if that makes a difference for you. Because for some people, they're pretty sensitive to that. Okay. And then, of course, with your coffee, be careful of what you're putting in it, right? So we don't want to just cancel out the benefits of it with like added sugar or a bunch of like heavy cream, like saturated fat. So just, you know, be judicious and be very careful about like those coffee drinks that are really more like desserts. Tea is associated with reduced risk of type 2 diabetes, so that's a great addition. Lots of different varieties of tea. So if you're not a caffeine person, but you can do some like herbal teas, lovely way to get in extra color, extra antioxidants in your day. And then there's been a lot of talk about alcohol lately. So alcohol at moderate levels has been associated, like small amounts associated with less type 2 diabetes. Not that that means that you should start drinking if you don't already, And we do know that it can raise HDL, or your good cholesterol, a little bit. However, it has lots of calories. So if you're watching your weight management, be careful because that adds up really quickly. And the recommendation is don't start drinking if you don't already consume alcohol. And if you do drink, what's considered moderate is 1 drink per day for women or 2 drinks per day for men. Can't add that up and just like do 7 on the weekend. It doesn't work like that. It's like moderate drinking, not binge drinking. And that equates to a pint. Like if we're talking about beer, that's a pint. Or if we're talking about wine, it's like a 5-ounce pour, which is not very much. Like my mug here is my coffee, tea, got tea in here right now. Mug is like 14 ounces. So, the pour would be like teeny tiny in here for wine. Or for hard alcohol, it's like a 1.5 ounce. So that would be considered like one drink. But really the amounts associated with reduction in type 2 diabetes is like half of a drink. So we're talking about like small amounts. And we do see in some of the blue zones that, some of the blue zones where people live long and healthy, they do have moderate amounts, or it's really actually small amounts compared to what most Americans drink, as far as our portions go. Small amounts of alcohol. So it can be included. Part of the deal with the glucose thing is that actually alcohol lowers blood sugar, which you wouldn't think it would do based on where it comes from, because it comes from a carbohydrate, right? That it comes from rice, or it comes from potatoes, or it comes from corn or barley. But once it's actually converted into the ethanol, when you ingest it, it's metabolized completely different. And so it does a couple things. One is it's tying up your liver from kicking out sugar. So the liver's processing the alcohol first, so it's busy doing that and not kicking out extra glucose. And then even at the cellular level with the uptake of the alcohol, and the uptake of the sugar is a little bit different. And so we see this reduction in blood sugar from the alcohol, not an increase. But if you are adding, like let's say it is like a mixed drink, like a cocktail, like gin, and you're adding a sugar thing like juice, then the juice, of course, will have the sugar. And so you may see an increase in blood sugar from that. Or if it's like rum and Coke, the Coke will have the sugar, right? So then it will raise blood sugar. But straight up by itself, we don't see it raising blood glucose. And so that might be part of it too, is like there's a little bit of a lowering effect on blood sugar, which might be a surprise to some of you. Okay, let me check the Q&A. Should nuts be raw or roasted? Yeah. So if they are roasted, just give them a smell, really, if they're raw or roasted. Like, you want to make sure that those nuts and seeds have not gone rancid, so they haven't sat around too long. The roasting process, because it's heating, so it kind of speeds up that process to rancidity. So that's why, especially with like anything that's been roasted, you want to give it a good smell and make sure it still smells really fresh and smells like nuts, and it's not that musty off aroma. You'll know it if it's turned. So don't eat any like nuts and seeds or like your oils. If you've had like like a walnut oil sitting in your pantry for 5 years, it's probably time to throw it out. Start over with some fresh, so it's more heart healthy. Okay, but the bottom line with all of this, and there's a lot of details in your book that you can read more about, but there's no one single diet that is best for everybody. So you need to figure out for you, like, what's going to work? What are you maybe missing? Focus on real foods. We'll talk about patterns at a future class, like timing of intake and pairing of macronutrients. But for now, I would think about like what you're missing. Think about your food groups. Maybe look at that DASH and Mediterranean pyramid and see how your intake is compared to those more plant-based patterns. Maybe use the plate. Check your plate at home. Check your portions, how are you balancing things right now? And maybe you try some new foods. Like if you haven't ever had tofu, for example, maybe you try that out because it's a nice lean protein source. Um, and then small changes. Small changes is the way to go about this so that you're gradually shifting things over time. And I would, again, really emphasize focusing on the positive, like focus on what to add, because that's going to be so much more sustainable for you and more fun in the long run. And generally, more nutritious that way, because then you're really focused on like the nutrients that you're getting instead of what you're taking away. Okay, so in your books, if you have the Preventing Diabetes book, there is a survey to kind of do your own assessment on how your dietary intake is kind of stacking up. So you can go to page 57 to 58, take that little survey, and see, it'll actually point out some areas for you once you add it all up, maybe where you're a little low and you can maybe identify some areas to bump up. And that should help you set some goals for the coming week or even for like the coming month, if you're thinking, until our next class. And then when you're setting goals, ideally, our goals are going to be pretty smart. So instead of just like a general, like I want to increase vegetables, we really want to get kind of specific with that. So for example, you could say, I'm going to make half my plate vegetables at dinner 4 nights a week. Make it even more like super realistic and specific. So you can, if you have a specific, did you meet it or not? It's measurable. You can like see is half the plate, vegetables or not. It's something you can do. It's focused on a behavior that's actually doable. Is it realistic to do 4 nights a week? Maybe for you it's not. Maybe you start with 1 or 2 nights a week, half vegetables. And then set a deadline for yourself. Like, in the next week or in the next 2 weeks, I will try and accomplish this. So you have a little bit of a time frame for it. And there's a worksheet for setting some SMART goals in your book at the back in the appendix area, page 285. So I highly suggest doing this for, different goals. Maybe you have an exercise goal, maybe you have a dietary goal, maybe you have a different behavioral goal, like less sitting, for example, and you can make that very specific and kind of break up your day. I have mentioned movement a couple times because normally at this point in the series, we like jump to exercise, like next week would be exercise. But instead, we're going to follow the book's progression. We're going to do chapter 4 next week. But I want you guys to not be forgetting about muscles and movement because it is so, so important for managing your blood sugar. The movement versus sitting, building muscle versus the losing muscle that we tend to just be doing gradually as we age. Every little bit counts. And we know even like 2 minutes of movement after a meal helps with the lowering of the spike from the meal in your blood glucose. So even small amounts really add up. So that could be a goal where you're just saying, okay, instead of sitting and just, sitting on the couch after dinner, I'm going to do some of my strength exercises at that time, fit in some resistance. Or maybe that's where I do my stretches, even the stretching, because you are putting some resistance on your body. That is helpful. Maybe you're going to say, okay, I'm going to take a walk and get the mail instead of just sitting right after the meal. Move a little bit and then relax for the night. But I want you getting started with the exercise and activity side of things because it's so vastly important. It's a really big piece of the puzzle. So I don't want to just wait until chapter 8 when they finally address it in chapter 8. So get started on that now. Okay, so here's your homework. You're going to assess your diet with the quiz. Maybe pick, this says 2 to 3. I would even say 1 to 3, 1 to 3 small changes that you want to work on this coming month. If you meet those goals, in the meantime, you can always set higher goals, or set new goals. So you want them to be achievable so you actually have that success and then the success builds on itself. success builds on success, right? So you feel good about it, you've met your goal, and then you are moving forward. Maybe make them really smart, get detailed around those goals, because then that helps you to identify like what you're doing, when you're doing it, what does it look like. Make sure it's realistic and has a time frame to it. And if you find that you're not meeting those goals, then it's probably either not realistic or it's not the right goal for you. And when you've written it down, you can actually go back to see like, okay, what do I need to tweak here? So it's really helpful to go through that process. And then your reading homework is to read the next chapter, which is chapter 4, and we're going to talk about weight management specific to blood sugar control. And are there any other questions? So Barbara says, I'm monitoring with a meter, but when to test? That's a great question and could be one of your goals. So I would want to know a couple things. I would want to know, what is your blood sugar doing over the night? Like, how are your hormones controlling your glucose for your fasting? Like when you wake up, within 15 minutes, ideally, of getting up, you're going to check your blood sugar and see like how are things controlled overnight. And then I'm also curious about, what is the food doing to your blood sugar? Like how are you responding to different meals? And if you guys want to try this, if you don't have a glucometer, you can get a glucometer pretty cheaply at like Walgreens and Rite Aid and CVS and any sort of place where you can get those kind of pharmaceutical type things. And usually the meters come with a packet of little test strips too. So you could do some tests and get curious. With a meal, for example, I would want to know going into the meal, what's your number, and coming out of the meal 2 hours later, after you've digested a little bit, what's your number? And like look at that difference and pick some meals that are your favorites so that you're really seeing things that are, meals that you're eating on a regular basis. And again, that changes like 30 to 60 points is pretty typical for a meal. That's pretty normal. Okay. So if you're going much higher than that, like maybe it's too much carbs, or maybe it's not enough protein or enough of those vegetables. Or if you're not moving at all, maybe you actually need to bump up the carbs, or you really have wiggle room to bump up the carbs a little bit more. So it can give you some feedback on things. The other time that would be interesting is possibly after exercise. If you want to get motivated towards movement and you want to see a night where you just sit on the couch versus a night when you take a walk and what your blood sugar does with that, you could do some comparison there. I will tell you, it's pretty motivating to see that blood sugar drop when you're moving your body. You could also do a pre-bed, like check before going to bed to compare to a fasting number in the morning. And we can talk through some of these scenarios in the future, like what some of these scenarios might mean and some strategies around that. But I love that idea, Barbara, because you're educating yourself basically on your body. You're getting more information about how you're responding to things. So you can be really curious about it, and then you get the feedback and it helps you to make changes that are really specific to you. Great question. Okay, well, have a fantastic month, everyone. We will be back same time, same place. Literally, it'll be the 3rd of March, in 4 weeks from now, Monday night at 6 o'clock. And I wish you all really good goal setting and a lovely month. And I'll see you in March. All right, take care.